Hello my loves, my name is Hannah and welcome to my September reading wrap up. Now, this time last month I sat here absolutely buzzing. I was fizzing with excitement having just had my best reading month of the whole year. I'm talking quantity and quality. I read a lot of books, but most importantly, I read a lot of books I loved. I was really enjoying the reading time I was having in August, and then September arrived with the start of the new academic year, and with it my brain descended into jelly, and let's just say it has impacted on my reading. So I did read, I'm gonna be clear, I did read this month and I read some books that I really liked, some really good books. But my overall vibe from my reading in September was that I struggled to get going a bit and I struggled to stay interested in what I was reading. And I really don't think that is a reflection on the books that I was reading. I think it has absolutely everything to do with just my brain being full, my brain being busy, all of these things. All of these things impact our reading, right? And it's fine, but I lost my reading mojo a little bit, and that made me sad for a chunk of the month. With that disclaimer, I did read 9 books this month, which came to just under 2,700 pages. Now, I'm very conscious that for some people that's a lot, and I'm not kind of like bemoaning my slightly slumpy reading month in order to make anyone else feel bad about the number of books that they're reading. I feel like that goes without saying, but just in case it doesn't go without saying, I'm gonna say it anyway. But reading is my main hobby. It's the thing that brings me a lot of joy. So when I find myself in a situation where I'm not getting a lot of joy from my reading, that's what causes me to be sad about not having read quite so much, okay? It's not to do with the numbers. It's everything to do with like how I felt while I was reading. We'll do some brief stats, shall we? Because I wasn't very interested in doing stats this month, if I'm honest, but I did uncover a few things. The average publication year was 2023, and this is because I've been reading a lot of the Booker Prize long list. I haven't completed the long list yet. There's still a few books that I may or may not read. But I've been reading a lot of that, and that's obviously books that came out in the last 12 months. And I wonder if, I feel like I contradict myself all the time on this channel, because on the one hand I'll say, oh, I read a lot of like new books, and I read loads and that was really exciting. I think I said that last month, that I was like, maybe I read so much and I was enjoying my reading so much because they were all like current. And I think the opposite was true this month, because, you know, we're complex creatures. We don't always feel the same about things. And I actually wonder if by the second month of the Booker long list, I think I get a bit fatigued of seeing the same titles being spoken about over and over again. And my excitement for getting to some of the books diminishes almost the more I hear people talk about it, because I am a rebel at heart. So the more I see people talking about books, sometimes the less I want to read them. So I wonder if that's played into it. And this is the thing that I wonder if this really did impact on my slump, right? So of the 9 books, 3 of them were ebooks, 4 of them were audiobooks, and 2 of them were hardbacks that I got out of the library. And that meant that I read nothing that I owned. And it also meant that only 2 of the books I read were physically in front of me. So I also think there was an element of, I couldn't see that I was making any progress in my reading, if you see what I mean. Because like when I've read a book, I put it in like this little basket in my bedroom where I keep it until I'm ready to wrap it up at the end of the month. And that there was just like no books in it all month. And so I think even when I was reading, I felt like I wasn't reading. And it's interesting to me that I would feel like that this month, but I think I do normally read, even though I always have audiobooks and I am becoming a more frequent reader of ebooks. I think this was the first month where I really got majority audio and ebooks, and my physical books really got a little bit neglected this month. It also meant I think I was reading like buzzy books and books that had been around rather than anything that I actually owned, and I think that might have been a factor. I don't know, but I think it might have been. Let's get on and talk about the books. Along with not being very ready this month, I am at my least articulate at the moment. I'm not quite sure what's happening. I've been having a lot of meetings at work. I've been doing a lot of talking. I'm going on holiday in a couple of weeks, and we're busy prepping for that because it's quite a big trip and it's very exciting. But the amount of brain that I have available to talk about these books is a smaller proportion than normal, okay? So bear with. The first two books I'm going to talk about are two ebooks that were actually, I was supposed to read them for my impatient reading vlog for September, which eagle-eyed among you may have realised is not a video that I put on my channel this month. Normally, at the start of every month, I pick 4 books that I'm excited to read that month, and then I read them and I vlog my reading of them. And I've been calling them my impatient reading vlogs for this year because reading impatiently was something that I wanted to get better at this year. And I read 2 of the books, and then when it got to about 5 days left of the month and I was yet to pick up the other 2 titles, I kind of had a little word with myself and thought, Hannah, is this going to happen? Are you going to read these books? And I was very honest with myself and said, I am not. So I'm going to talk about those first, the 2 that were supposed to be in a vlog but weren't. So the first of the books that I read was So Late in the Day by Claire Keegan. Now, this is my very first Claire Keegan book. I know she is an author who is pretty well loved. I love Irish literature, so she's someone that I've been meaning to get to for quite a while. And I saw that my library had an ebook of this, and I thought, great, I'll grab that. I'll grab that because I do want to read small things like these, but I'm saving that for a book to screen adaptation video that I'm going to do because there's a new Cillian Murphy adaptation coming out around Christmas of that one. So I thought I'll read something else. And I saw this in the library and I thought, great, yeah, I'll read that. And I liked it. So this is a story following a man who is on a bus on his way home from work, and we're told the date right at the start of the book, and we think nothing of it really, and then by the end of the book we understand the significance of that date. And the book basically takes place during this character's homegoing, right, in this kind of like on this one day, but he's reflecting on essentially like maybe the one that got away. It's really a kind of gentle, quiet musing on regret and the sort of the way that the what if questions that we have about our lives can haunt us in kind of even the most innocuous of moments. So I enjoyed it. I really liked the prose. I thought the characters were pretty complex given the length of the book. And this was something that I wasn't quite prepared for because I read it as an ebook, so I didn't quite know. And my library copy said that it was 62 pages, but I can never tell. Sometimes I'm reading on my phone, sometimes I'm reading on my on a tablet, and I never know what that actually shakes out at in terms of actual pages. But this book was around 30 pages. I wouldn't even call it a novella. It felt like a short story. And because I hadn't quite realised as I was reading how quick it was, I felt like it was over in a flash. And those of you who've been on the channel before will know that I have a pretty miss and miss relationship with short stories. There's very few short stories that I like. And I just always end up feeling like, oh, that was a really nice, like, amuse-bouche. Where's the main course? And I did feel a little bit like that. I'm glad I read it, and it was a good introduction to her writing style, which I thought was beautiful. There's a real kind of crispness and clarity to it, which I do think you get with really great short story writers, because you have to be so economical with your language, because you kind of can't go talking around issues, and you have to kind of be quite direct in what you're communicating because you don't have much space. And I thought that was really well done. But this book is sold for like £8.50, and I'm sorry, I would feel so gypped if I had ordered that and a book that short arrived. I know you can see the page numbers of things when you order things, but am I grumpy? Because it just felt a bit like I was really surprised that it was a standalone book and not part of a collection or expanded out into a kind of like more novella length book. But hey, I mean, if a publisher's going to pay you to write a 30-page short story, then I mean, go for it, I guess. And then the second book I read as part of that vlog that you will never see was Shy by Max Porter. Now, I read Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter earlier this year and really loved it. He's an author that I had been meaning to get to for quite a long time. A number of people had said, I think you're really going to like Max Porter. Oh yeah, I think you're really going to like Max Porter. And I do. And I'd heard most people say that Grief is their favourite of his books. And I loved this one. I loved it even more than Grief. This is about a young teenage boy called Shy who has found himself at a kind of sort of like an alternative provision setting. He's basically not been coping well, has been kicked out of mainstream education, and he's found himself at this institute, basically, which is a kind of like dilapidated old country estate in the countryside that's been repurposed to be used as an alternative provision for sort of young teenagers who've maybe lost their way a little bit. And Shy's found himself here, and the book takes place over one night, a bit like So Late in the Day. And I like this conceit, right? I do enjoy books that do this, where you have technically a very short amount of time passing between the start and the end of the book, but through that kind of present, you're exploring the past. And so that's what we get. So Shy at the start of the book we know it's nighttime, and we know he is sneaking out of the house with a really heavy bag, but we don't really know what's going on. And we slowly start to realize what's happening as the book goes on, and that is quite a difficult revelation to deal with. So as Shy takes this sort of like sad, lonely walk at night, the present gets interrupted with this barrage of sort of like other content, and it's an incredibly fragmented book that's quite overwhelming and confusing to read at first, but I think that's really effective, because at the point that we meet Shy, he's at a very low ebb in his young life, right? And all of his relationships have broken down. His relationship with school, he's got a difficult relationship with some of the other students that are at this provision. He's got a difficult relationship with his mum, who's wonderful but flawed, and his girlfriend. And so he feels like a very dislocated character, and the prose reflects that. So we have all of these the ebook, I don't know how closely the ebook matched the original kind of printed version, but there were lots of different type fonts in the text that sort of represented, I guess, different voices, or voices from a different time. So you get kind of Shy in the moment, and then you get remembrances of scenes with some of these other people in his life, remembering like some of his therapy conversations and arguments that he's had with his mum, and various moments in his life where he's felt quite a lot of shame, quite a lot of discomfort and confusion, and also moments that he really regrets, things that he's done that he's not very proud of, and also moments where people have really let him down. And it does create this kind of barrage of feeling. It's not very linear the way it's told, and I did have to, it did take me a little while to settle into the prose, but I remember that also being the case with Grief is the Thing with Feathers, actually. But I just thought it was so brilliant at capturing the sort of balance of Shai is not represented as this two-dimensional, like, bad kid. I think we see characters like Shai cropping up in all sorts of media and in the news as well. And there can be a tendency with these sorts of boys especially to sort of homogenize that experience and to not really... It can be quite easy to pass off their behavior as like simple antisocial behavior or like things like that. But it's incredibly complex. Human behavior is really, really complicated. And there's all sorts of things going on under the surface of any person, especially a teenager, that people struggle to articulate and understand. And I thought the book captured that really, really well, without also, it never let Shai off the hook of accountability. Like he was both kind of fully explored in the range of experiences that he'd had and the sort of elements of his life that had maybe contributed to some of the actions that he'd taken. But there was absolutely no doubt, at least in my mind, that Shai is accountable for the things that he's done, and that both of those things can be true. And it got me, this book. I am like slap bang in the middle at work in my day job of working on a few different projects that are specifically looking at kids like Shai, basically. And I was really glad to have read this book this month, even if it did kind of like it did, I think, bring work a little bit more into my personal reading and possibly might have contributed to a little bit of the fatigue that I was feeling. But I thought it was just a wonderful exploration, but like not very narrative, not very story led. But I liked it. I liked it immensely. So yeah, that was Shai. So then the next book that I read, we're not going to spend too long talking about because I remember very little about it. This was 16 Horses by Greg Buchanan, which was read by Louise Bealey. And I remembered seeing this on, oh my God, what's it called? Between the Covers, which if you're not in the UK is like a reading TV show that we have on the BBC over here, which is delightful. And I thought it sounded quite cool. It was, what I understood about it going into it was that it was a kind of crime thriller, but where the main character was a vet, and that there had been some kind of incident at the start of the book involving a crime that had been committed with horses, very Equus vibes. And that there was a kind of like forensic vet who was brought in to consult on the case. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I really enjoyed, as you may know, the Frida Klein series, which follows a psychotherapist who works alongside the police. And I enjoy the kind of outsider perspective in crime fiction sometimes, where it's not like a straight up, like you're following the victim or you're following the perpetrator or you're following the investigator, that you kind of got someone who is a little bit parallel to the investigation, but not 100% in it. And I thought it sounded cool, but I just didn't really get on with this book. I found it quite tedious, and I think it was a debut. And there were parts of it that I liked, but you know when you're holding out for an ending and you're like, okay, we'll see where it ends up, and it could maybe win me back round if something very clever has been done with the ending. But for me, I felt like the crime at the start, which is basically that these kind of butchered there'd been horses in this village had been taken from various kind of properties, so not owned by the same person, and they had been butchered and kind of left in a slightly ceremonial way. And I felt like there was no underlying impetus behind the story, except for the fact that the author thought that that was kind of a cool setup. So I was a bit disappointed in that one. It didn't really do much for me, and I would have probably stopped reading it if I'd been reading a physical copy. And it was only because I was listening to it on audio while I was like pottering around the house doing whatever that I kind of stuck it out to the end. But yeah, not for me, that one. The next book I read is one of 4 that I read this month that were from the Booker Prize longlist. So I read The Safekeep by Yael van der Wouden, and I really enjoyed this book. It's a historical novel that's set just after the Second World War in the Netherlands. And we're following a central character who's living in this house. It's her sort of family's home. Her parents have passed away and she's living there on her own. And she feels very, very, very protective of this house. She is not particularly interested in getting married. She doesn't want to leave the house. She feels very connected to this house, and she is, like I say, very possessive of it. And at the start of the book, it's got one of the like most intriguing first chapters, I think, of the books that I've read on the Booker Prize long list so far this year. And she basically finds a bit of porcelain in her back garden and realizes, oh, that's like one of the rabbit plates from like my mum's collection, but that was always kept kind of locked in this like glass cupboard. And she goes and looks and she goes, but there isn't a plate missing. That's really weird. What's this doing out here in the garden? And then plot happens and you kind of forget that that's where you ever started with the book until it comes back in towards like the last third of the book. But I really enjoyed this book, but I feel like I'm going to struggle to talk about the themes of it and what I liked so much about it, because I feel like it's a bit spoilery to talk too much about it. Like, I really think it's a great book to go into with really not much of an idea about where the narrative's going. But essentially, this woman who is very set in her ways, very particular, very introverted, has this older brother who is the opposite of all of those things, and her brother is set to inherit the house because of the era. You know, it would go to the oldest male sibling. So at the start of the book, she's gone to dinner with her 2 older brothers, and her eldest brother is kind of known for always bringing like a different woman out on these like family meals, and the other 2 siblings basically get tired of having to pretend that this woman is gonna last when they know that it's a bit of a revolving door where he's from. And then the younger brother is a gay man, which is kind of sort of, it's not an issue in the family, but it's not exactly spoken about and upfront. And I really enjoyed the scenes with the 3 siblings together. I thought she captured sibling dynamics really, really well. So we begin early on with this meeting where they're meeting the latest girlfriend of the eldest brother. Except this one seems to have got her claws in a little bit, and ends up wangling an invite to the house. The brother is basically going away to work, and yes, I have forgotten all of their names. He's going away to work, I think in England, for like an extended amount of time, and manages to convince the sister that his girlfriend should come and stay in the house, with like a little bit of "it is my house" though undertone to it. And then we're basically following that. We're following this woman with this incredibly unwanted house guest who seems to be sort of crossing all of her boundaries and being exactly the wrong sort of person for her. And the book is really about ownership and place and the importance of our possessions and what it says about who we are and what happens when our kind of legacy of possession is disrupted for one reason or another. And I kind of don't want to talk anymore about it because I don't want to give away kind of where the narrative goes, but I really enjoyed it. I did find it around halfway through, I was a bit like, where are we going with this? But just, if you pick this book up and you find yourself feeling like that, trust the process. I really enjoyed it. I think it's in my top three books in the long list so far. I really enjoyed it, and I'm really glad that it's been shortlisted since I read it. And then should we stick with the booker? So the next books that I'm going to be talking about are all ones that I will have spoken about in more depth in my September weekly reading vlog, which I did manage to successfully film and put up on my channel last week, I think. So I will link that down below, and I'll kind of rattle through these ones quite quickly. So the first one I read was My Friends by Hisham Matar, which was narrated by the author, and I really recommend the audiobook for this one. I thought it was great. And this is following a main character called Khaled, and at the start of the book, he is in King's Cross Station at a moment in time where one of his friends is going to Paris and one is going or has just gone to the United States. And we understand at this point that it's a bit of an end of an era for this kind of friendship that the three men have had. And we find out quite early that all three of them are Libyan men who have been exiles from their homeland for various reasons for a very long time. And so we start at the end and then we loop all the way back through history and we come back to that moment at the end. It's quite circular. And I really enjoyed it. I thought I haven't read maybe any books kind of set in and around the kind of Gaddafi. I certainly know fiction books, I don't think, set around the Gaddafi dictatorship in Libya. And young Khaled is so like idealistic and hopeful, and he basically gets a scholarship to study in Edinburgh, but then kind of ends up meeting one of these friends who goes on to be one of his lifelong friends, and they decide to go to a demonstration in London at the Libyan embassy, and as a result of that they are exiled from Libya. They're basically blacklisted. They can't get home. He has to be really careful about what he tells his family because all of the phone lines are being tapped and he doesn't want to put his family at risk. So, and I just thought the book captured this sort of statelessness so well, and the kind of experience of being like a modern exile. It really was kind of, there was so much loneliness in it and so much kind of disconnection, which made the moments of where we really see these friendships developing between these three men was so important. There was also a huge amount in it about kind of translation and sort of using translation as a metaphor for sort of being somewhat existing as an exile, or I guess you could extrapolate it out kind of more broadly to being an immigrant, to being sort of translated into a culture that is not your mother culture, for want of a better way of phrasing it. And I thought it was really, really interesting. I'm surprised it wasn't shortlisted. I did, though, find the last kind of chunk of the book, maybe the last fifth, got away from me a little bit, and it felt like these threads that had been so carefully constructed throughout the book got a little tangled, and then we kind of rushed to untangle them a little bit at the end. But that also could have been my brain. at the time that I was finishing this off. But I thought it was great, and I really recommend it. Then the next book was another one that I absolutely loved, and this is this also in my top 3? I think it probably is. This is Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood, which is read by Ailsa Piper. This is an Australian book, and it's another quiet, contemplative book that sort of doesn't really have much of a story, but we're reading basically the diary of a woman who has returned to her hometown after a period of time, unspecified, being away, and she grew up Catholic, but has since sort of like lapsed. She doesn't consider herself to be a religious person, but she finds herself sort of called to this nunnery in this rural part of Australia. She has just got out of a relationship that is ending or has ended. I mean, her partner basically has moved to London, and she's sort of like, well, I think we both know that I'm not going to. And she's just sort of drawn to this nunnery, and she ends up sort of living there, not as a sort of religious subject, but just sort of I think drawn to the quietness of it, the sort of comfort and familiarity of it. And as she's there, she's reflecting a lot on her life when she was younger. She's reflecting a lot on the loss of her parents. And it was really interesting because I couldn't really tell how old she was throughout the book. At times I felt like she might have been in her 30s, and then at times I felt like she might have been in her 50s. I think she was in her 60s actually, because there was like a line in one of the lines about something being at least 20 years ago, which made me think, oh, hang on, she's maybe older than I thought she was. And it's told, as I said, almost as if it's her diary. And Jen Campbell made a really great point about this book that I hadn't quite, I hadn't put my finger on until she said it, and then was like, yes, that's exactly it. This book avoids giving you exposition in a really good way. Because if we are writing a journal, a diary, that is not intended to be read, because we're not a famous person whose, diaries are going to be published posthumously. We're just an ordinary person. No one's ever going to read our diary. We don't explain things like the significance of things, or we don't always explain who people are, and we don't say how old we are, or, what happened, how old we were when a parent died, because we're writing it for us and we know those things, so we don't have to explain them. And so there was this great sort of balance in the book between, you get an extraordinary amount of access to this woman's brain because she's being completely unfiltered with herself, but because we aren't her, we also don't get that much. There's part of it that it always feels a little bit withheld, and I think it's that not quite knowing that keeps you engaged. And then there's sort of bits and pieces that are happening in and around the nunnery. There's the mouse plague that is going on, which I've never heard of a mouse plague, and have since found mouse plague TikTok, and I wish I hadn't. That's scary. It's like loads of mice. There's just like loads of mice overrunning this like nunnery, and it's set during COVID, but not named as COVID. So there's a lot of kind of isolation going on, and a lot of sort of threat. But it really is a kind of quiet, gentle book, but really beautiful, I thought. I've never read Charlotte Wood before. I'm really glad to have read her now. I always feel like in my head I've read more Australian fiction than I actually have, particularly kind of like Australian authors who are writing now. I think I'm not very good at staying abreast of writers from that part of the world, so I'm really glad to have discovered Charlotte Wood, and I'll definitely be reading other things by her. And then the last book that I read from the Booker, the standard Booker list was Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner, and this is a fun book. It's kind of hard to describe. We're basically following a woman who is American, and she has been previously worked as an undercover agent in America for the government, and has a bit of a history for sort of infiltrating fringe groups to give intelligence back to the government. So she has previously been involved in a case of like a young group of environmental activists, and she kind of like got involved but was a little rogue about what she did, and slightly convinced sort of some of the people involved in that group to kind of urging them towards criminal action rather than just seeing if they were going to. So she's a bit of a suspicious character. And when we meet her, she has stopped working for sort of the government, and she started working in the private sector. And she's just been engaged to go and infiltrate another environmental group in rural France, where there's this kind of settlement of sort of climate activists and conservationists who are very against the monopolizing the monoculture that is sort of being propagated in the region. So they basically got rid of all of the agricultural diversity of the region. The big businesses trying to turn it into basically just a corn producing area. And that's going to have all sorts of environmental impacts. And as part of what they want to do, they're trying to divert all these watercourses into one mega basin to provide all of the water needed to grow all of this corn in this region of France. So she's there to kind of infiltrate their plans because there's a couple of suspicious characters in there, and her mythical employers, we don't know who they are wanting to know what they're planning, basically. And the book kind of goes off from there. But it's funny because it felt like a pacey read, but actually the content moved quite slowly. And I think it's because there were an awful lot of sort of digressions. So she hacks into the emails of one of the sort of older people who's working with this group, kind of on the fringes of this group now, but he's a bit of a like patriarch of the movement. So she reads all of these emails that he sends to the group before she's actually even infiltrated it. And he's very interested in like Neanderthals and like the history of Neanderthals and what we know about them, and whether or not they did or didn't overlap with Homo sapiens, and kind of like this idea of trying to understand where we've come from. And I really enjoyed some of those bits more than the actual plot of the book, particularly towards the end. So I found myself really enjoying those bits. And as we were ramping up towards like, because there's plot that happens, there's stuff we move, but I found that actually a little anticlimactic, weirdly. But I really enjoyed the character, the voice. She is a kind of love to hate her character. She's not a nice woman, and she's very morally grey and ambiguous. But the book it tackles so many kind of big ideas and questions, and I thought it avoids easy answers or kind of like stereotyping. And I really enjoyed it. It's not my favourite book on the long list, but I thought it was good. And the first book I've read by Rachel Kushner, who's definitely an author that I would read again. And then the last book that I spoke about in detail in that reading vlog was Kairos by Jenny Erpenbeck, which was translated from the German by Michael Hoffman. And I spoke about this book so much, so I'm really not going to talk about it too much, but this won the International Booker Prize this year. And it is set in East Germany, in East Berlin, sort of right before the dissolution of the German Democratic Republic. And I'm so conflicted about this book because I really liked parts of it. So we are following two characters, Katharina and Hans, and she is 19 when she meets Hans, who is, I think, in his 40s. And they begin an affair. He is married, and the affair is quite intense and complicated, and becomes incredibly problematic. And we're kind of following their affair over a few years, and as I said, the kind of the dissolution of East Germany as a separate country to West Germany. And I really liked some of the prose. I thought the themes were so interesting. I absolutely loved this setting. I thought it was really great to read something that was set in East Berlin and from and not the kind of stereotypical version of East Berlin that I am familiar with as someone who grew up in the capitalist West. Who, you know, like when I was studying about this era of Germany, all the only narratives that I got growing up were that anyone who was in East Germany didn't want to be there, wanted to be in West Germany, very much like a victim of what happened there. And the portrait that Jenny Erpenbeck paints in Kairos is much more nuanced than that. And it captures really well this idea that East Germany existed for a really long time, actually, much longer than Nazi Germany and the Weimar Republic. So it had real meaning and people had real identity attached to this idea of East Germany. And when that's kind of pulled out from under the feet of people, it causes all this kind of existential dread. And for Hans, as an older man who spent all of his life pretty much in this, but remembers the kind of Nazis, grew up in that era, but has kind of grown up pretty much as an adult, spent most of his life has been in East Germany. This sort of imminent threat to his country is manifesting in all sorts of interesting ways in him. But it's not a long book. It's only 260 pages, but it took me so long to read. And I think it was the book that just tipped me into some very slumpy times. But it's sort of, I think it was a really good book. I think I maybe wasn't quite in the right headspace to read it. I think if you're interested in the themes, you should definitely give it a go. I'm sad that I didn't like it more than I did, because I think it was doing a lot of stuff that if I'd read it at a different time, I might have responded a little bit better to it, but hey ho. And then the final book, I just mentioned at the end of that video that I'd started reading this book, and I did finish it, and it was I Will Crash by Rebecca Watson, which is the second book by Rebecca Watson, the second one that I've read. I really enjoyed her debut novel, Little Scratch. Enjoyed is a difficult, maybe not the right word for that book was about sexual assault, so enjoyed, not the word, but I thought it was very moving. And she's got this very, very particular way of writing, Rebecca Watson, that I think translates so well to audio. So if you are interested in this book and think you can stomach it, I would recommend the audio, because Rebecca Watson has this very stream of consciousness style of writing that really puts you inside a character's head. It's very fragmented and fragmentary, the way that she writes, and I find it so effective. I believe it will be very Marmitey. I think there will be lots of people who this writing style doesn't work for at all, but I think if it works for you, it really works for you. And this is following a young woman who, right at the start of the book, her brother knocks on her door. And we don't know what their relationship is, but we gather from pretty quickly that it's not good. She doesn't want to speak to him and she sends him away. And then the next moment in the book is a little bit later on, I think maybe like a month later, and it's her dad calling to say that her brother has crashed his car and has died. And the book is the immediate aftermath of her finding out that her brother has died. And they had this incredibly complex relationship where the narrative that she's got of him is that he was incredibly insidiously abusive to her, not in a way, but in a way that was clever because everyone else in her family sort of minimizes it and passes it off as just sort of sibling behavior. Things like he used to grow his thumbnails really long and like jab them into her back, so she had all of these like cuts on her back but people would be like, he's just messing with you, or he'd kind of emotionally manipulate her, and she was scared of him, and as they became adults, she kind of drifted away from him, but in a way that her parents didn't quite understand, and maybe thought she was being a little bit dramatic about it. And I thought it captured the sort of the way that when traumatic things have happened to you in your childhood, especially, it can be really hard to work out what the true memory is, because obviously every time we revisit a memory, our brain slightly alters it. And so there are numerous moments in the book where she's going, am I just making a big deal out of nothing? Like, was it fine? Have I just made like the biggest mistake of my life by like refusing to speak to my brother and now he's dead? Or actually, like, did he really hurt me? Did he really do me harm? And I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was like really, really well done. I really related to the main character like quite a lot. It's got us, if you've read Little Scratch, it's got a slightly longer time frame. I think Little Scratch was like 24 hours inside this woman's head, but this is a sort of similar experience, but over a slightly longer period of time. And yeah, I think Rebecca Watson's got such a distinctive way of writing, and I'm really interested to see what she does next, because I think there was quite a gap between Little Scratch and this one. And I think something that will be like leveled at her is that it's very similar. Like, the characters and the situation are different, but the experience of the book and the way that the book is written is very similar to Little Scratch. So I think if you liked Little Scratch, you'll like this. And if you didn't, you won't. But I'm curious to kind of see if she just keeps continuing in this vein. As someone who responds really well to that style of writing, I wouldn't be bothered if this is the only style of writing that she ever does. But I think maybe, I've kicked you, sorry. I think some people might find that a little bit repetitive, but certainly at the minute I would lap up anything and everything that she writes. So that's that. Those are the 9 books that I read this month. Other than a couple of like misses, I think you'll agree, I've been pretty positive about these books. So I don't know why I felt so down about my reading this month, but I guess sometimes when we're busy, we just don't have the brain power for it. I have realized that I can't do the Booker again, I think. And I think it's because of timings, because my busiest time at work is always September every year. So I can't, and because the Booker Prize kind of is basically August to September reading and going a little bit into October, I just think it's the wrong time for me to be reading Booker Prize books, which is such a shame, because I really enjoy the kind of community. As much as I said I get bored of seeing the same books on my feed over and over again, I really enjoy the community of lots of people reading kind of like the same sort of titles, and I will have a huge amount of FOMO not doing that next year. But I think if I were to wait and then kind of visit the long list maybe over the course of that year, that would probably work better for me, and I should maybe prioritize reading slightly lighter, easier books in September. I have just started, a couple of days ago, for example, I started reading Gwen and Not in Love by Lex Croucher. And I know you might be thinking, hey, that's YA, Han. You don't really like YA. And I don't, but this is Arthurian YA. And it's not very YA, and it's gay. So it's a whole separate thing, but it's really scratching an itch in my brain at the minute. So I was like, okay, right. I gotta read some gentler things. I've got to read some lower stakes things. I've got to read some things that don't make me so like, why is the world like this? So if you have any recommendations for books that are like that, not necessarily YA, because there are only a few people's YA writing, like Lex Croucher and Alice Oseman, that I can read. Most YA is is not for me. But if you have kind of adult fiction that's those vibes, I would love your recommendations in a comment down below. Also, let me know if you've read any of these books. Let me know your thoughts. I am always curious to see if you agree or disagree. And what was the best thing you read this month? I hope you had a more enjoyable reading month than I did. Over the next month, you are going to see quite a lot of pre-recorded content because I am going to Japan. So I'm going to be away for 2 weeks. So I'm hopefully going to record a bunch of stuff ready to be released for while I'm away. So there probably won't be gaps. Famous last words. There probably won't be gaps in what I'm putting up, but it won't be the normal sort of content that I have. I'm thinking of doing a live react to Heartstopper season 3 for next week's video. So join me for that if you want. And if you've enjoyed this video, give it a little thumbs up. That would be lovely. And I will see you all for another video very soon.